Hello, this is Paul Nixon of Find My Past. Nice to be back talking to you all again. I've put together a few slides on the theme of recollection and remembrance, and specifically my grandparents, my grandfather on the Nixon side, and also some interviews I ran with First World War veterans years ago. And it was really my grandfather that sparked my interest in the First World War, and so it's appropriate now at this time of remembrance that I should remember him and my grandmother, for that matter, and the men I spoke to and interviewed, starting a long while ago, back in 1981, before many of my colleagues at Find My Past were even born. Makes me feel increasingly old. Anyway, this is where it begins for me. I was 60 this year, as you can see. I don't know what my parents had fed me in that photo at the bottom there, something alcoholic perhaps, looking at that face, but I come from a close family. I've got a brother and sister who you don't see there. I was fortunate that I had all four grandparents up until I was 17. My dad is a little older than my mother, and that's reflected in the age of his parents as well. They're that much older than my maternal grandparents. But I was, as I say, very lucky to have them for as long as I did. And it was my grandfather, Walter Leonard Nixon, up in the top left there, who served in the First World War. And I very much regretted when he died in 1980 that I hadn't spoken to him more about his wartime service. Although it would have been difficult, frankly, because he was very deaf. That could have been old age, or it could have been a legacy of working on heavy artillery with the garrison artillery in the First World War, or a combination of both. But in any event, I did regret not having spoken to him. You pick up these snippets when you're young about, Granddad did this or saw that, or little stories. Granddad went into a estaminet and came out, and the horse that had been there and the man with it had been blown up and there was nothing left of them. Or when he went out souvenir hunting and found a boot and only to discover a leg still in it, and all these little stories that we were told, but I never actually spoke to him properly about it. And so that set me off after he died in March 1980. And after a period of reflection, I then started to try and compensate, in a sense, I suppose, by interviewing other men who'd served in the First World War. And the first man I spoke to was a man called Leonard Wade, and we'll come to him in a minute. The Nixon family were certainly well photographed. There were 5 boys and 7 girls. I've never spoken to any of the sisters, but I have spoken to one of the younger brothers, the one in the middle there, who's Alf Nixon. But on the left, you've got Edgar, Alf, and Walter, my grandfather. Then another one of Alf in the middle, and then Jack and Sid on the right. Jack, standing up in the bowler hat, was killed in November 1918, and that was another story in October 1918. That was another story that always did the rounds, that Jack was killed, but nobody at that stage knew when Jack had been killed or where he was killed. It was only later on that I uncovered that and then passed that on to other family members. But they were certainly well photographed. There's Edgar sitting by a gun of some sorts. He was with the RFC. That's another one of Jack there with the Rifle Brigade, probably taken in 1916. The brothers out and about on the town. At home with the family, there's Jack at the back, half hidden by an aspidistra, then my grandfather Walter, then Sid, then my great-grandfather, and then Edgar. Most of these boys worked for Carter Paterson in London. And then you've got sisters down below and the matriarch in the middle. And as I say, a close family. I think the dynamic was certainly spoilt by the First World War. Jack being killed, Sid deserted. So it was never the same again after the war. But the family was still close. And I'm lucky that I have all these photos of them. So it was with all that background that I then set off to find more veterans, and the first man I met was this man, Alfred Wade. I'd seen in the local newspaper. I live in Chelmsford in Essex, and it would have been the Essex Chronicle. That he and his wife had just celebrated their wedding anniversary, and their 65th wedding anniversary. So it mentioned in the article that he'd served in the First World War. So I wrote to them. I think I forwarded the letter wrote to the Essex Chronicle, and they forwarded to Mr. and Mrs. Wade, and Mrs. Wade wrote back, and that's the letter there that she sent to me in August 81, inviting me to go and see them, which I did, and I was fascinated to listen to him. I made notes. I didn't take a tape recorder in those days, but it transpired that he joined the Royal Fusiliers, then the Middlesex Regiment, and he was reported killed in action. And this is the letter on the left here from the officer, Percy Chipperfield of the Middlesex Regiment, to Frances Wade, informing her of her husband's death. It's my grievous duty to inform you, he says. I only hope that your sorrow will be in a degree lessened by the fact that he died. Excuse me. He died like so many other men that England may live, a good soldier and a comrade. And she also received a letter from one of his companions as well, which we'll look at in a minute, or just a brief extract from it. But in actual fact, of course, he hadn't been killed. He was taken prisoner. And now, of course, with the benefit of years of digitization since that interview 40 years ago, we see many records for these men that just weren't accessible to me at the time. So things like medal cards and medal rolls and service records, for that matter. There was no internet, of course, in 1981, and prisoner of war records as well. And this is where this index card comes from. It comes from the International Committee of the Red Cross collection, and you've got the prison references there. So there's extracts from those references. He was at Schneidermuhl and at Limburg. You get the dates there of when he was captured, 13th of May 1917, and where he lived, etc. Where it says in the bottom one, Fell El Hüfte, it's verletzt linker Hüfte, or hurt left hip. I don't know, excuse my German. Anyone who's fluent German would have winced at that. But this sort of really also highlights the difficulty with these records. There's a discrepancy in the place of capture and the date of birth, and the date also conflicts, for that matter, with Percy Chipperfield's account. It suggests that he probably lay wounded overnight and was picked up the following day. So they thought he had been killed on the 12th, and he was actually picked up the following day on the 13th. So all that was, without seeing these documents, of course, when I was talking to him back in 1981, it was fascinating. And here's the other letter that I mentioned a minute ago from Private Wall, who was one of his companions, who says, I know by now, writing again to Frances Wade, I know by now you have heard officially of your husband's death, and believe me, you have my sincerest sympathy. Your husband was my best chum, and I miss him sadly. He was brave and never seemed to fear anything. So she received these letters, and then in July 1917, she received a postcard from her deceased husband informing her that he was actually recovering quite well. And there he is, appears in this list of wounded men published by the War Office. He's the last one there that you can see, Wade 50167A from Witham. So he didn't move very far. I saw them in Kelvedon, which is not so far away from Witham. And that was the first interview that I conducted with them, and it really set me off to try and find out more. So I contacted the Essex Chronicle again, and they published a piece on me. I forget what I phoned up for now. It wasn't to say, do you want to do a piece on me? I'm interested in contacting First World War veterans, but whoever I spoke to thought there was an angle there, and they did do an interview with me, and they photographed me talking to Daniel O'Sullivan, which is the photo on the left. That was published in the Essex Chronicle in September 1981. So I would have been 19 then. I was 19 on the 13th of that month. And Daniel O'Sullivan served with the Royal Field Artillery. He was one of several brothers who signed up. I think I forget how I got in touch with him. There was a group of men who lived not a million miles away from where I lived, and they all lived in a fairly close proximity to each other, and a number of them went drinking together at the local pub called the Ship in Broomfield Road. If anybody knows the Ship in Broomfield Road in Chelmsford, that was it. Back in the days when they had a public bar and a saloon bar, and I actually used to go tag along on occasions and go for a drink with them as well. But the Essex Chronicle then published this appeal that I wanted to speak to veterans and contact veterans, and men came forward, and I ended up speaking to quite a few men. There's just a sample there. You'll see the names coming up in a minute, or where they're from anyway. But you've got, well, I can remember the names for that matter. You've got Bob Bailey on the top left, who was RAMC. In the middle, Bert Burton from Birmingham, Mr. Boldero from Norfolk. Then at the bottom, John Brett on the left, Harry Bardley in the middle, and Reg Crane in the right bottom. I never knew them as Reg and Harry and Bert. I was always respectful and knew them as Mr. Burton or Mr. Bardley or Mr. Brown, etc. And I always referred to them as such. It's changed somewhat now, but I always referred to them as such. I never thought of them as Harry or Bert or Bob. And I decided when I was speaking to these men that it was I'd record some key information, which you can see there on the left-hand side, and take my tape recorder with me as well. And I did, and initially I didn't always put the tape recorder on. I sort of came to an instant assessment, thinking, is it worth putting a tape in and getting it running, or should I just make notes? And that was a mistake on my part. I should always have put the tape recorder on, and latterly I did do so, but initially I didn't. So it means, for instance, that I don't have Bob Bailey, Mr. Bailey, speaking on tape, but I do have this man Bob Burton, and I do have Harry Bardsley, and I do have John Brett, but Reg Crane, Mr. Crane, there with his wife, and Arthur Boldero, I don't have their voices on tape. I also decided that I would take photos of them. So having met Mr. Wade and his wife, I didn't take photos of them, but I did thereafter take photos of the men I went to see, if they were happy for me to do so. And I guess, although I lived in Chelmsford, many of these men had, well, either they were living in Chelmsford originally or from Chelmsford. So Bob Bailey was certainly a Chelmsford man. Reginald Crane at the bottom there had come to Chelmsford with the Berkshire Regiment in 1914 and met his wife, and then came back to Chelmsford and lived in Chelmsford for the rest of his life. So he was very much, he was a Berkshire man, but had settled in Chelmsford and been living in Chelmsford for many years. But these other men had mostly come into Chelmsford as a result of being elderly and moving to be closer to family. So you've got Bob, as I say, Mr. Bailey from Chelmsford, then you've got Birmingham, Norfolk, Stockport for Harry Bardsley, who was a Manchester pal, John Brett from Southminster, and as I say, Mr. Crane from Newbury and Berkshire. So that set me off on my interviewing, and as I said, there were some men who lived very close. This is an aerial view of John Henry Keane Memorial Homes in Chelmsford. Reg Crane, Mr. Crane lived next door to Harry Leakes, who'd served with the 9th Essex. And around the corner there was Clifford Rust. There's another man, Bill Minchin, who's not on this, who lived in the top right-hand corner here. And at the bottom, Alan McCartney Castle, who lived in Elms Drive, which is just south of the Keane Memorial Home. So there's 5 veterans there. I don't know a collective term for veterans, but I suggest it could be an enthrall of veterans, because I was always enthralled listening to them, telling me about their times. And I just liked their demeanour, their personality, their gentleness, really, their decency. Well, I don't need to explain to anybody who's been in touch with that generation, but it was, you'll never see the like again. And it was my privilege to have met them. Stan Brown was a regular soldier, a career soldier, and I have played a clip from Stan in the past, and I'm going to play it again now for those of you who haven't heard it. The men I met were from all sorts of backgrounds and from served in many different branches of the armed services, or certainly the army. So you had territorial force men, pre-war territorials, you had men who joined up because Kitchener asked them to join up, you had men who were conscripts, men who joined under the Derby scheme, and career soldiers like Stan. And Stan was a regular soldier, a Londoner, born in 1897, enlisted with the Leicestershire Regiment in July 1913, arrived in France in September, and was then wounded several times. He was the last surviving member of the Old Contemptibles Association for Chelmsford, and he died in 1897 at the age of 90. And this is him talking about the Christmas truce in 1914.
At Christmas 1914, we had, I don't know what you call it, a kind of an armistice, if you like, to say there would be no firing on Christmas Day, but it didn't happen just like that. On Christmas Eve, I mean, as far as we was concerned, we were still at war, but on Christmas Eve, during the sentry go on night time in the trenches, we heard singing from the Jerry. It was only 50 yards away, and they were Saxons, best of my recollection. And we had to stand too because we didn't know what the singing was all about to start off with. And what happened was that we all stood to, and then on our Jerry's wire there was bits of paper, bits of rag, all sorts of things saying that Happy Christmas, some in German, some in English, because there were a lot of the Germans have worked in England. And they offered up, and they held up a bottle of wine, and I know our bloke shot at it. And when we all got quiet, I don't know if we had breakfast that morning. Yeah, I suppose we did. We had a drink, but everything was peaceful. And Jerry eventually, one of the Germans held up a card and come on over the top to Merry Christmas on it. And everybody was dubious in our trench. They was kind of saying, shall we go or shan't we go, and all this blooming day. And then one or two more Germans come up. Then eventually we decided, well, they hadn't got any rifles that on, so we went over. And our Buchanan Dunlop, he was battalion commander, and then come to us with a battalion. And what happened was that he kind of led the singing. And we didn't all group in one place. We were spread along an area about 100 yards. And we mixed in with some others, and they give us a bottle of wine and cigar. And we went off in Jerry Land, mate. All we got is a tin of tickler's jam. And we went back in the trench and bought out a couple of 3 tins of jam and give these Jerrys, and they give us a bottle of wine and cigar. And I borrowed a big wooden maul off one of the Germans and knocked some stakes in our trench. And because you couldn't, chapel armadiers, there was so much mud, you couldn't hold it back.
So I amused myself, educated myself by speaking to veterans in Chelmsford, in and around Chelmsford where I lived. And then in 1982, I went to university at Loughborough, and for 3 years I studied snooker and darts very hard, and somehow managed to come away with an English degree, a good English degree. But so that was me in 1982. And I just, in the spare time I had, being a student, when the dartboard or the snooker table didn't call me, I also tried to track down veterans in Loughborough as well, with some success. So again, these men, I cherish their memories, and I'm so glad I met them. Most of these men, I think all of them, all the ones you can see there anyway, and it's not the complete list of men that I met, were all from that area. So, and you can see there, top left, Harold Shepherd, and top right, Wilfred Wortley, both from the same territorial force battalion, Leicestershire Regiment. The man at the bottom, Alfred Willis, 4th Leicestershire Regiment, another territorial, later Royal Field Artillery. And then Sherwood Foresters, Leicestershire Yeomanry, and at the bottom as well, Mr. Hutchinson, Leicestershire Regiment. And, you know, if I was collecting accents, and I was certainly adding to my collection quite richly here, because you had these beautiful East Midlands accents now. Having met people in my hometown from all over the country, really. Here I was meeting people from Leicestershire with their rich accents. 3 of these men won the military medal as well. Henry Thirlby Hack, in the middle with the Leicestershire Yeomanry, was awarded the military medal for action in 1915 at Fresenberg Ridge, and the other 2 men later on in the war. So again, each time I would go in, take photos, and record what they were saying. I'm going to turn now to another man, Arnold Marshall, and there's another recording from him, which is probably 4 or 5 minutes long. He was a Yorkshireman, born in Sowerby Bridge. I see that I interviewed him in April 1984, so I must have been back in Chelmsford, probably for the Easter break that year, and met him. I can't remember how I got in touch with him, how he was brought to my attention, but he was a Yorkshireman. As I say, he attested under the Derby scheme in December 1915. So the Derby scheme allowed men to attest and then await call up. It was really the last opportunity for men to volunteer before conscription came in the following year. So he attested under the Derby scheme. His regimental number can be dated to the 18th of May 1916. So that's when I know that he joined up, and he arrived in France in August 1916. So he didn't train very long. He went over with the tanks in September 1916, and then in December 1917, he was wounded 3 times during. He said Passchendaele Ridge, the Third Battle of Ypres, had officially finished by that stage, but he was still there, and he'll tell you now all about it.
Fortunately or unfortunately, that Christmas Day I was wounded on Christmas night of 1917 on the Battle of the Passchendaele Ridge. There was no trenches. Our one platoon had been a big shell hole, and to get to the next, you'd go into another shell hole. You had to go over the top. There were no trenches, communication trenches. Each platoon had its own big shell hole. They trenched as well as they could. And this Christmas Eve, I was detailed along with some more to go down to where we were going to be brought out of the line, the unboxing. And we had to practice fetching the invoices, practicing going down, which is about 5 miles down the line, down Loughborough, is what we're left of. And we did it all right. And Christmas Eve, it rained, and there was blackout, and there's been a sniper, killed a captain, and however, came back. I was wet through, and we got through Christmas Day. It snowed all day Christmas Day. Resulted everything was as white as by night, and I had to go again, you see, down the line for another practice to bring the new lot up for the chapter. However, as I say, I set out at 10 o'clock at night and to go over the top, and I got the packet. I was hit 3 times by this sniper. And the first time there when it went in, with a great big rock, I put my fist through where it came out. And I tried to bring that back home, really. Somebody pinched it from me. And I must have been out about an hour, I was told afterwards. And they sent the specimen. I came to again. I came to and I crawled on my tummy where I was being taught. I could see a great big shell hole. And I got down, I got partially over into it. Well, now, if I had again, it hit me in the hip here. And of course, I went down into the shell hole, and they could see all this from where I come from, going to such a bright, starry night with just occasional showers of snow. and they sent us a couple of stretcher bearers down to fetch me out. They could see I was knocked out, and they got down to me, and then, can you walk? So I said, I'll try and walk, and they were set off, the three of us, down to company headquarters. We were supposed to be going, and suddenly it was under a shower, under a snow shower, and then suddenly the moon came out and all was bright again, and we got the sniper hit all three of us. I was hit again through the left hand there. You see that? I can't bend that. I was shot straight through there. That's the third time. The other man was shot. One of the other stretcher bearers was shot in the calf, and the other in the hip, and he died. We got him down to the dressing station. In the morning after, we got down. We lay there all night then, right till 6 o'clock the morning after. A sergeant from company headquarters, which hadn't got nearly there, seemingly, he saw us, and he brought us into company headquarters, the three of us, and we got because the doctor was there at company headquarters. He bandaged me up, and the others, one was the stretcher cases king. Got it in the hip. The other got it in the calf. He could manage to walk a little bit. So we set out morning after. We had it was boxing morning that, and we had it with the enemy. They were watching us. They had a truce for us to get out. There were three of us, and some more had been wounded during the night. And I was there in front, holding my white flag on with my rifle, up with the white flag on. And we marched down, right down out till we got down to the ambulances. They came up as far as ever they could, the ambulances, but there was still a couple of miles to go. They didn't come any further, you see. And we got down there, and that's where I got down to him.
And that's pretty much what you hear there is how I ran things with these talks. I would get that basic information at the start and then just let the men talk. Occasionally later on I would chip in, and initially I didn't really want to hear my voice on tape recorders, so I tried to be as silent as I could, but I would just let the men talk. I guess now, you know, if I was interviewing them again, I'd have all this information at my fingertips. As I said, there was no internet then, but you know, I guess typically, if you were seeing somebody now, if you knew the man had served with, in his case, with the 8th Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps, you'd do the background research, you'd look at the war diary, you'd find the medal card, you find the medal rolls, you know, Silver War badge, as much as you could, and go armed with that. But in those days, I didn't have any of that foreknowledge really. But anyway, in any event, it's none the worse for that, I think. But it does mean that now I'm able to go back and look at things to find all these men in census returns, for instance. You know, we take it for granted that there's so much available at our fingertips now on Find My Past and elsewhere. You find them all in all these cases for the First World War. Anyway, the 1901 census, 1911 census, 1921 census, now 1939 register, of course. All these documents that we publish, you'll find them in electoral registers. There's so much information there that you can add to what you already knew, or what I already knew at the time. This is the 8th KRRC War Diary from the 25th of December 1917. He mentions in that talk that the sniper got his captain, and that's the captain, Captain Brownsword or Brownsword. It says hit by machine gun fire there, and I wonder actually whether he was hit by machine gun fire rather than the sniper. I don't know either way, but it certainly mentions that the captain was hit by machine gun fire there, gives the location, gives the battalion strength as 270 other ranks, which is crazy for a battalion. It's such an under-strength battalion at the time, presumably due to the casualties from Passchendaele. But to have just a battalion strength of 270 other ranks is incredible, really. But the war diaries you can, of course, download free of charge from the National Archives. Just Google National Archives War Diary, and you'll come to the pages. You need to then sign up, register with the National Archives if you want to download things for free. If you don't sign up, then you'll end up paying. But if you register with the National Archives, you'll be able to download the diaries free of charge, and they're well worth accessing. It's a really super resource. In 1986, I'd finished university. I was back in Essex, living on and off with my then girlfriend at the time, who was in Great Dunmow in Essex, and she, I was obviously there during Remembrance Day on this particular year in 1986, and I was very struck by Donald Banks, who I think read the exhortation at this around the War Memorial. He's the man in the middle there in that photo, and I remember being amazed that he could even have been a First World War veteran. He didn't look old enough to have been in the First World War. He was very upright, spoke very well, had a very deep voice, and as I found out later on, a deep Lincolnshire accent. He'd been born in Ragby, a village, Wragby, in Lincolnshire, and he was a very young soldier in the First World War. He was born in January 1899, and yet he was overseas by 1915 as a 16-year-old, and was wounded as a 16-year-old at Zillebeek in September 1915. And that's the photo of him there, looking every inch the 16-year-old, to my mind. He's a very young soldier indeed. So I'm going to listen to him now, share some of his talk with you now about when he was wounded. He talked about being at Zillebeek with his battalion, and had seen the Germans firing shells over. They were testing, they were ranging really to get the measure of the shells, and the third shell caught Donald and his companions in the dugout, and this is what he explains.
From what I can make out, I'm the only one left. They told me later that Pygott, my head was bent down. The fellow in front of me must have taken a full blast, blown to pieces. And Pygott, the top of his head was taken off. Well, I started to run towards this ridge, and then my sight went. And I called out, and one of the Staffordshire fellows came up and said, "All right, John, come on." He led me on to the dressing station. There they bandaged me. And treated other casualties. After a while, the shelling stopped, and it had started to rain. They carried some on stretchers. They couldn't get the ambulance up to this post because of the shell holes. We had to walk some hundreds of yards to where the ambulance was. By holding on behind one of the stretcher bears, holding on to him, slipping and staggering along, we eventually reached the ambulance. There I was put on a stretcher and we were taken to the rest camp. We left there all night. Next morning, the medical officer came round. He was a major, a specialist of some kind. And he looked at me, he said, what's the trouble? I said, my eyes, I can't see, sir. They're sore. So he pried into my eyes, trying to open them, but the pain was too intense. He had to wash his eyes out carefully. They should never have bandaged him like that. He might have gone completely blind. Later on, he came to me again, and I was beginning to glimmer a little bit of light. And this persisted 2 or 3 days. I just lay on the stretcher. They brought food to me, soup and stew or something or other. I had to be fed by hand. And then the officer suddenly said to me, "How old are you, son?" I hesitated for a moment. He said, "Now, tell me the truth." I said, 16, sir. "Yes," he said, "I guessed it." And he turned to the auditor and said, "You see, you can tell by the formation of the bones that he's not 19. I bet you gave your age as 19. I said, "Yes, sir." "All right, son," he said, "we'll see to you."
So Donald Banks talked to me for hours. I had at the time, a dozen tapes. That was my modus operandi. I had my tape recorder. Many of these men, I would cycle to see. I strapped the tape recorder to the back of the bike and cycle over and see them, and just keep putting the tapes in. And I had a lot of tapes from Donald. He had a fantastic memory, a great recall, a lovely accent. That creaking you can hear was from his wonderful wooden chair in his study. He had a lovely chair, which every time he moved it creaked, and you could hear that in that recording. A lovely desk as well, and plus he'd got loads of notes and photos from the time. He kept all his notes from when he'd been on shooting ranges, on the rifle range, showing the scores, and he was quite well documented at the time as well in where he lived. I mean, these, again, with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of millions of pounds spent on digitization, we can now find him in the Lincolnshire Chronicle. When I met him originally, that clipping on the left-hand side he had as a clipping, and I had it rendered as a photograph. I took it to a photographic studio in Chelmsford, and they turned it into a print, and I've got that as a print. It's only latterly, in the last couple of years, no more than that I have found that article was published in the Lincolnshire Chronicle, but just by going into the British Newspaper Archive site. I probably typed in Rugby Lad and his Indian comrade, and lo and behold, it came up. And typing in Donald Banks, Lincolnshire Regiment, brought up these other articles as well. So here's this photo here. The third one along is the photo you looked at a minute ago, which was again a copy that I had from Mr. Banks. This is Pygott, who he mentioned, who'd had the top of his head taken off in that explosion. And some years after I'd interviewed him, I did go to the cemetery in Belgium and found Pygott's grave and the other men who'd been killed on that day, and put a cross for them. But it's great that all this information survives, and as I say, there's a lot there that wouldn't have been available to me at the time, and that's just the beauty of family history research and military history research, and how much things have advanced in the last 40 years, how much is available. So, for me, and these are just my tips for interviews. I was fortunate. I consider myself fortunate that I did this at a time when I didn't have all the pressures and obligations that you get as a family man, I suppose. Or once you're the breadwinner in a house and you've got responsibilities, then you have less time, I guess, for things like this. I mean, I was living at home with my parents, then at university, living the high life. I never did master the art of snooker or darts. Had I done so, I would be probably be retired, having been successful in those sports. But anyway, but I would say don't leave it too late. I mean, I can say that, and yet I haven't interviewed my mother and father to any great degree. I've spoken to them. I've got snippets of information. I have spoken to my grandparents. I spoke to my grandparents when they were alive, but don't leave it too late. For me, the First World War, my interest in it was stimulated by my grandfather, and that's what drove me to go out and meet veterans. But for that matter, there's plenty of people around now who could tell fascinating tales, in a military sense, let's say, from the Falklands War, very much a war of my generation, and other conflicts since then. So don't leave it too late, because don't have those regrets that you didn't interview somebody. Always have a recording device switched on. In my day, it was a tape recorder, which made a lot of background noises you could also have heard, but now it's a phone. Make sure you've obtained the person's permission and that you and they are clear about the purpose of the interview. Don't make the event seem like an interview. Have the recording device switched on and let it be. That was very much what I did with my tape recorder. I just put it in the background and just sit there and listen, or chip in with questions and just forget it was there, really. Make sure the recording device is as near to mouth level as possible. And have some pre-planned questions if you can. Transcribe the interview. I used to sit there, come back with my tape, put it in the tape recorder, and then continually fast forward, play, rewind, play, fast forward, backwards and forwards, typing this up on an old typewriter. Well, it was a new typewriter at the time, but it was, I guess these days you could just dictate it into the laptop and it'll all come out for you. Be prepared to go back for a second round with questions. I did find that with a couple of veterans. So Mr. Burton, who was in that first photo I showed you at the top middle, and Stan Brown, certainly I went back to see them several times, and and got their further thoughts, because many of the veterans said, oh, after you left, I remembered I should have told you this and that, and so I did go back. But that's always worth doing. Follow up with whoever you've been speaking to, and offer a copy of the interview and transcript to your interviewee. I did that with all the men I saw, and that enabled next of kin in some cases to contact me later on and tell me that the person had died, and that or to just get in touch generally. And I guess for me, my interest certainly never waned in the First World War, but as the years went on and the men I'd known had died, that was always quite sad for me when they did die. And in the end, I stopped interviewing them. But I'm glad I did it. I probably met about 100 men altogether. So I've got meetings with them and letters and correspondence. So I hope that was of interest. I've enjoyed listening to them again and talking to you about it. And I hope it's been interesting for you. And let's not forget them this Remembrance weekend. Thanks very much for listening.